Hello, welcome to Mishra's Workshop, the place that helps you get the most out of your decks and commanders. Today's video, we're taking a look into Mishra's Toolbox. These videos are to give you deck building tips and tricks as well as card analysis for that gray area between high-level casual and low-level competitive. Today, we're taking a look at Zendikar Rising. Now, there is a lot to go over in this set, so let's get into it. Let's start off with the mechanics of the set. First up, Kicker's returning. Kicker is an ability that allows you to pay for an additional cost when casting the spell. If you pay for the Kicker cost, then the spell resolves with an additional effect. But if you choose to not pay for the Kicker cost, the spell resolves as normal. Let's take a look at Taijiru Paragon as an example. Taijiru Paragon costs 1 and a green for a 3/2 elf. It has a Kicker cost of 3, and when it enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, you reveal the top 6 cards of your library, and you may put a creature card that shares a creature type with it from among those 6 into your hand. The rest go on the bottom of your library in a random order. Now, it wouldn't be Zendikar without Landfall. Landfall is an ability that triggers whenever a land enters the battlefield. Now let's take a look at Kazandu Mammoth. For 1 and 2 green, you get a 3/3 elephant with Landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, Kazandu Mammoth gets +2/+2 until end of turn. But if you take a closer look at Kazandu Mammoth, you're going to notice one of the new mechanics as well, a modal land option. Cards with this option allow you to flip it over and play it as a land. However, once the card is on the battlefield, it cannot be flipped over. So Kazandu Mammoth cannot be flipped into Kazandu Valley, and vice versa. And finally, we have the most interesting mechanic in the set, the party mechanic. Cards that reference party give you a benefit for having a cleric, rogue, warrior, and wizard on the battlefield, but only one creature can count for one of those creature types. So if you have a cleric wizard, it is going to be either a cleric or a wizard. And some of these spells require a full party, which means you have to have all the creature types out on the battlefield. Let's use Coveted Prize as an example. For 4 and a black, you get a sorcery that lets you search your library for a card and put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. But this spell costs 1 less to cast for each creature in your party, and if you have a full party, you may cast a spell with a CMC of 4 or less from your hand without paying the mana cost. Next up, there are a few reprints I'd like to mention. Negate is a decent counterspell for mono blue decks looking for a little bit more interaction. Into the Royal is a solid removal piece that can draw you a card later in the game when you need it. And Disenchant is very good artifact and enchantment removal for decks that are not running green. Finally, we have Lotus Cobra. This is a great reprint for those Lands Matters decks and will give you so much more mana than you expect. Now that those are out of the way, let's get into the new stuff. Maddening Cacophony is a sorcery that costs 1 and a blue. It has a kicker cost of 3 and a blue. Each opponent mills 8 cards. If this spell was kicked, instead, each opponent mills half their library rounded up. There's only one commander that comes to mind that's going to want to play this card, and that's Bruvak the Grandiloquent. Bruvak is a 1/4 legendary human advisor for 2 and a blue, and says if an opponent would mill 1 or more cards, they mill twice that many cards instead. So, if you kick Maddening Cacophony with Bruvak out, you mill all of your opponents with just 1 card. And since that effect is off of a kicker cost, the CMC of Maddening Cacophony is still just 2, which means it can be searched out with Spellseeker. Confounding Conundrum is an enchantment for 1 and a blue. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card, and whenever a land enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, if that player had a land enter the battlefield under their control this turn, they return a land they control to its owner's hand. Since this effect goes on the stack, it can be easily played around by tapping the land before returning it to your hand. But if your meta still runs a bunch of land ramp, such as Farseek, this card can definitely put in some work. My only question? Why is this not a white card? Punishing green's land ramp and keeping it on the same playing field as every other color is such a white effect. This card should be white. Why is it not white? Anyway, next we have Thieving Skydiver. For 1 and a blue, you get a 2/1 Merfolk Rogue with flying. It has a kicker cost of X, and X can't be 0. When Thieving Skydiver enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, gain control of target artifact with converted mana cost X or less. If that artifact is an equipment, attach it to Thieving Skydiver. This effect is so good for higher levels of play. I'm almost never going to go after an equipment, but I am always going to go after those low-costed mana rocks. This effect reminds me of Copy Artifact, an enchantment for 1 and a blue that says you may have Copy Artifact enter the battlefield as a copy of an artifact on the battlefield, except it's an enchantment in addition to its other types. Copy Artifact can be used as a combo piece, but it can also be used to copy one of the mana rocks already on the battlefield. The most influential mana rocks usually sit between 0 and 1 mana, so for 1 mana more, instead of copying the artifact, Thieving Skydiver just takes it away. Lithoform Blight is an aura for 1 and a black. It's an enchant land, and when Lithoform Blight enters the battlefield, draw a card. Enchanted land loses all land types and abilities and has tap, add 1 colorless, and tap, pay a life, add 1 mana of any color. Now, I don't know if this card is going to see any play, but it does tech against Blood Moon. Blood Moon is an enchantment for 2 and a red that just says non-basic lands are mountains. This is usually a huge problem for 3, 4, and 5 colored decks. But Lithoform Blight gets around Blood Moon by giving the land the ability to tap for any color. So, if your meta is running Blood Moon and you're running black, give this a shot and see how it goes. Roiling Vortex is an enchantment for 1 and a red that says at the beginning of each player's upkeep, Roiling Vortex deals 1 damage to them. Whenever a player casts a spell, if no mana was spent to cast that spell, Roiling Vortex deals 5 damage to that player. You can also pay 1 red, and your opponents can't gain life this turn. This is a solid hate piece against those 0-costing mana rocks and those free spells like Force of Will. But if that's not enough, this shuts down Lion's Eye Diamond Loops with Underworld Breach and really puts a damper on Ad Nauseam. The downside? The longer it takes you to play this card, the worse it gets. Archon of Emeria costs 2 and a white for a 2/3 Archon with flying. Each player can't cast more than 1 spell each turn, and non-basic lands your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped. This is such a good upgrade for hate bears. It's like Eidolon of Rhetoric and Thalia Heretic Cathar had a baby, and that baby could fly. It blocks Tymna, it shuts down combos like Demon Fish, and slows down your opponents. The only downside you need to be careful of is that 3 toughness, so keep an eye out for those Anger of the Gods. Now, I couldn't make a Zendikar list without putting in at least 1 card that has landfall, and that is Nissa of Shadowed Bows. 2 black-green for a Nissa Planeswalker that comes in with 4 loyalty. She has landfall, so whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, put a loyalty counter on Nissa of Shadowed Bows. Her +1 is untap target land you control. You may have it become a 3/3 elemental creature with haste and menace until end of turn. It's still a land. And -5, you may put a creature card with converted mana cost less than or equal to the number of lands you control onto the battlefield from your hand or graveyard, with 2 +1/+1 counters on it. Landfall on a Planeswalker is insane, and it's going to be interesting to see how strong this can be in a Landfall Reanimator deck. Her +1 can be used as ramp. It just says, untap target land. That could be a Guy's Cradle, or that could be a Cabal Coffers. Now, I don't see this card seeing play at competitive tables, but this is a casual powerhouse. And I have to admit, I am biased towards this card, because I run a Lord Windgrace Lands Matter Reanimator deck. Zendikar Rising also gives us a new line of dual lands called Pathways. These lands have 2 sides that tap for 2 different colors of mana. You choose which side you want to play, and they enter the battlefield untapped. but they do not have the basic land types, so they cannot be fetched out. Now, you might be hearing people say that these are useless lands, but I disagree. They fit in a 2-color mana base that has very few utility lands. What's confusing is that there are only 6. Usually, if we don't get the full cycle of lands, they split it between the allied colors and the enemy colors. But they didn't do that this time. So if you're running a Selesnya, Orzhov, Dimir, Boros, Gruul, or Izzet deck that needs extra color fixing, give these a shot. Next is probably the most hype card of the set, Lithoform Engine. For 4 generic, you get a legendary artifact with 2 tap, copy target activated or triggered ability you control. You may choose new targets for the copy. 3 tap, copy target instant or sorcery spell you control. You may choose new targets for the copy. And 4 tap, copy target permanent spell you control. The copy becomes a token. This card has a lot of combo potential. The first 2 that come to mind are Basalt Monolith and Dramatic Reversal for infinite mana. But will this see play? It costs 4 mana and then another 2 to 3 to activate, meaning if you want to combo off with either Basalt Monolith or Dramatic Reversal, you will need 9 mana available. And Lithoform Engine is a huge lightning rod, so if you play it anytime before you're ready to combo off, there's a high chance that it's going to get destroyed. Right now, I don't know if Lithoform Engine is going to see a lot of play in higher powered decks, but it does have a lot of combo potential, so I'm going to be keeping a close eye on it. And now that the non-legendary cards are out of the way, let's take a look at some new commanders. Let's start off with the face of Zendikar, Omnath, Locus of Creation. Omnath is a 4/4 legendary creature, elemental, that costs a red, green, white, and blue. When Omnath enters the battlefield, you draw a card. Landfall, so whenever land enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 4 life if this was the first time this ability triggered. You add a red, green, white, and a blue to your mana pool if this was the second time, and the third time deals 4 damage to each opponent and each planeswalker you don't control. Now that landfall trigger seems kind of lackluster, and you can't even abuse it like other cards with landfall. But there is one card that Omnath can abuse very well, and that is Food Chain. Food Chain is an enchantment that costs 2 and a green. It says, remove a creature card you control from the game, add X mana of any color to your mana pool, where X is the removed creature's CMC, plus 1. The mana may be spent to only play creature spells. This is one of the strongest win conditions in CEDH right now. Using Food Chain with a creature that you can play from exile, like Squee the Immortal, will give you infinite mana and allows you to play Omnath an infinite amount of times, which lets you draw out your entire deck. With those colors, Omnath has a lot of potential for being a strong Food Chain commander. White gives you access to enchantment tutors, while blue gives you access to counter spells, along with spells like Manipulate Fate, which let you search your library and exile your 3 Food Chain targets ahead of time. This might sound extremely hopeful, but I think Omnath will give Korvold a run for his money for Food Chain King. Next up is Yushan, Implaceable Earth. Yushan is a 4/4 legendary creature, elemental boar, that costs 2, green, and white. When Yushan enters the battlefield, search your library for a basic forest and a basic plains, reveal them, and put them into your hand. Players can't pay life or sacrifice non-land permanents to cast spells or activate abilities. This is such a strong hate bear. It stops fetch lands, it stops Lion's Eye Diamond, Aetherflux Reservoir, and Necropotence. But Yushan is a symmetrical effect, so you're going to need to build around it, which is very limiting. If you decide to build Yushan, make sure you add some cards that hate against Food Chain and Thassa's Oracle. Aura Skyclave Hierophant is a 3/3 legendary creature, core cleric, that costs 2 white, black. He has lifelink, and whenever Aura or another cleric you control dies, return target cleric with lesser converted mana cost from your graveyard to the battlefield. A Cleric Aristocrats deck with Aura at the helm can be very resilient and can win in a flavorful way with Leonin Relic Warder and Animate Dead. Leonin Relic Warder is a 2/2 cat cleric for 2 white. When Leonin Relic Warder enters the battlefield, you may exile target artifact or enchantment. And when Leonin Relic Warder leaves the battlefield, return the exiled card to the battlefield under its owner's control. Animate Dead is a very wordy aura that enchants a creature in your graveyard for 1 and a black. It essentially returns any creature from any graveyard to the battlefield under your control with -1/-0. And when Animate Dead leaves the battlefield, sacrifice that creature. Using Animate Dead on Leonin Relic Warder gives you infinite death triggers, allowing you to win with Blood Artist or Zulaport Cutthroat. But if you want to stay on flavor, you could also use Pious Evangel. For 2 and a white, you get a 2/2 Human Cleric. And whenever Pious Evangel or another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you gain a life. You could also pay 2, tap, and sacrifice another permanent to transform Pious Evangel into Wayward Disciple. And whenever Wayward Disciple or another creature you control dies, target opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. If your meta is slower but very interactive, giving up some speed for resiliency might be the answer. Now let's take a look at Ashaya, Soul of the Wild. For 3 and 2 green, you get a legendary creature, Elemental, whose power and toughness is equal to the number of lands you control. Non-token creatures you control are forests in addition to their other types. They are still affected by summoning sickness. Now this is a very interesting ability. It's meant to be landfall support, but there's a lot more than meets the eye. Ashaya with Quirion Ranger and any creature that taps for 2 or more mana now gives you infinite mana and infinite enter the battlefield triggers. Quirion Ranger is a 1/1 elf for 1 green. You can return a forest you control to its owner's hand, untap target creature, but you may only use this ability once each turn. Since Ashaya makes all creatures forests, you can bounce Quirion Ranger to itself and untap that mana dork that taps for 2 or more mana. You then play Quirion Ranger again, and since it is a new creature, you can then activate it 1 more time. You can then abuse this loop with effects like Beast Whisperer to draw out your entire deck, or Finale of Devastation to swing out and kill your opponents. Now we're going to jump into Zendikar Rising Commander decks and see what goodies they have for us. Let's take a look at the commanders. We have Obun, Moldiah Ancestor, a 3/3 legendary elf spirit for 1 red, green, white. At the beginning of combat on your turn, up to 1 target land you control becomes an XX elemental creature with trample and haste until end of turn, where X is Obun's power. It is still a land. Obun also has landfall, so whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. We also have Anawan, the Ruin Thief, a 2/4 legendary vampire rogue for 2 blue, black. Other rogues you control get +1/+1, and whenever 1 or more rogues you control deals combat damage to a player, that player mills a card for each 1 damage dealt to them. If the player mills at least 1 creature card this way, you draw a card. So we finally have a landfall commander in white. You could play Omnath as the white landfall commander, but I'd recommend sticking with Obun. That landfall trigger is a lot more relevant and doesn't have a cap on how many times you can trigger it per turn. I think an Obun deck would be a slightly more aggressive landfall deck than you're used to. I'd suggest sticking with aggressive landfall triggers like the new Morag, Fury of a Comb, and +1/+1 synergies like Hardened Scales. Morag is a 6/6 legendary Minotaur warrior for 4 red, red. Each creature you control gets +1/+0 for each time it has attacked this turn. And it has landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, if it's your main phase, there's an additional combat phase after this phase. At the beginning of that combat, untap all creatures you control. An optimized landfall deck doesn't usually have a problem playing those higher CMC spells. You could build Obun 2 ways. You could either go wide or you could go tall, but either way, it requires a lot of setup. Okay, now let's actually take a look at Anawan. So Anawan is kind of all over the place. He's a rogue tribal commander, but he's also kind of a mill commander. He doesn't really do either very well, and he's kind of just a mixed bag. I'd suggest if you want to go rogue tribal, that you use Sig River Cutthroat, a 1/3 legendary merfolk rogue that costs Demir. So you can either use 2 blue, 2 black, or 1 blue and 1 black to cast him. At end of turn, if an opponent lost 3 or more life this turn, you may draw a card. You could build Sig the same way that you would build Anawan as a rogue tribal commander, but you get more consistent card draw with Sig than you would with Anawan. And if you want to use Anawan as a mill commander, I highly recommend Phoenix, God of Deception instead. Phoenix is a 4/7 legendary enchantment creature that costs 3 blue-black with indestructible, and as long as your devotion to blue and black is less than 7, Phoenix is not a creature. Creatures you control have tap. Target player puts the top X cards of their library into their graveyard, where X is the creature's toughness. Phoenix is usually built defensively instead of aggressively, and since your mill is not connected to the combat damage, you can actually mill your opponent's entire deck before killing them. But if your heart is set on Anawan, there is one flavorful combo that I can recommend you play. Notion Thief with Teferi's Puzzle Box. Notion Thief is a 3/1 human rogue that costs 2 blue-black. It has flash, and if an opponent would draw a card except the first one he or she draws in each of his or her draw steps, instead that player skips that draw and you draw a card. Teferi's Puzzle Box is an artifact that costs 4, and at the beginning of each player's draw step, that player puts the cards in his or her hand on the bottom of his or her library in any order, then draws that many cards. That player draws his or her card for the turn first. Notion Thief with Teferi's Puzzle Box essentially locks your opponents out from ever having a hand. It might be a little mean, but rogues don't play by the rules. Now finally, there is one more new thing coming with Zendikar Rising. The list. The list is exactly what it sounds like. A list of cards. These cards are all reprints and can only be found in set boosters. This list has a bunch of reprints for Commander, so let's get right into it with Simian Spirit Guide, a 2/2 ape spirit for 2 and a red. But most of the time, you're not even going to cast it because you can remove Simian Spirit Guide in your hand from the game and add 1 red to your mana pool. Simian Spirit Guide is solid ramp for those mono red decks and also free ramp for those storm decks. Monastery Mentor is a 2/2 human monk for 2 and a white with prowess. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put a 1/1 white monk creature token with prowess onto the battlefield. This is a great reprint that gives an aggressive strategy to those spell-slinging white decks. Rest in Peace is an enchantment for 1 and a white. When Rest in Peace enters the battlefield, exile all cards from all graveyards. If a card or token would be put into a graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead. Even though Rest in Peace has been seeing a lot of reprints lately, it is still one of the best grave hate cards in the game. Angel's Grace costs 1 white for an instant with split second. You can't lose the game this turn, and your opponents can't win the game this turn. Until end of turn, damage that would reduce your life total to less than 1 reduces it to 1 instead. Angel's Grace does 2 very important things. It stops someone from comboing out on their turn with effects like Demon Fish and Laboratory Maniac, but it can also be used with Ad Nauseam to draw your entire deck. Enlightened Tutor is an instant for 1 white that lets you search your library for an artifact or enchantment, reveal it, shuffle your library, then put that card back on top. Enlightened Tutor has been skyrocketing recently, and even though this isn't a meaningful reprint, it's better than nothing. Fabricate is 2 and a blue for sorcery that lets you search your library for an artifact, reveal it, and put it into your hand. Another solid tutor, especially for those blue decks that aren't running black. Pact of Negation costs 0 for an instant, counter target spell. At the beginning of your next upkeep, pay 3 blue. If you don't, you lose the game. This is a staple counterspell in EDH. Brain Freeze is an instant for 1 and a blue with Storm. Target player puts the top 3 cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard. This card was only printed in Scourge and has been one of the go-to win cons for Underworld Breach. Training Grounds is an enchantment for 1 blue. Activated abilities of creatures you control cost up to 2 less to activate. The effect can't reduce the amount of mana and ability costs to activate to less than 1 mana. This has only been printed in Rise of the Eldrazi and is a staple card for those Thrasios decks. Cruel Tutor is a sorcery for 2 and a black. Search your library for a card, then shuffle your library and put that card on top. You lose 2 life. Cruel Tutor doesn't see a lot of play outside of those mono black decks looking for a little bit more consistency. Necromancy is an enchantment for 2 and a black. When Necromancy enters the battlefield, it becomes an aura with enchant creature put onto the battlefield with Necromancy. Put target creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control and attach Necromancy to it. When Necromancy leaves the battlefield, the creature's controller sacrifices it. You may also cast Necromancy as though it has flash. But if you do, you sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. This is a staple in those reanimation strategies. Body Snatcher is a 2/2 minion for 2 black. When Body Snatcher enters the battlefield, you may choose and discard a creature card from your hand. If you don't, remove Body Snatcher from the game. When Body Snatcher is put into a graveyard from play, remove Body Snatcher from the game and return target creature card from your graveyard to play. It's not seen as much as Necromancy, but it is still very playable in those creature-heavy reanimation decks. Food Chain. I'm not going to get into it too much because I already talked about it with Omnath, but it is one of the strongest win cons in CEDH right now, and I feel like this was planned with Omnath. There are a couple lands being reprinted, Dryad Arbor and Nykthos Shrine to Nyx. Dryad Arbor is a 1/1 creature land that sees a lot of play in creature-heavy strategies. Nykthos Shrine to Nyx has tap, add 1 generic to your mana pool, or you can pay 2, tap it, and choose a color. Add to your mana pool an amount of mana of that color equal to your devotion to that color. This is a great land for those monocolor decks that are very permanent heavy. The Chain Veil is a legendary artifact that costs 4. At the beginning of your end step, if you didn't activate a loyalty ability of a planeswalker this turn, you lose 2 life. Pay 4 and tapping it, each planeswalker you control may activate one of its loyalty abilities once this turn, as though none of its loyalty abilities have been activated. This is a great reprint for those Super Friends decks, and also makes the Chain Veil Teferi loop more accessible to new players. Isochron Scepter is an artifact for 2. It has imprint, so when it comes into play, you may remove an instant card with a converted mana cost of 2 or less in your hand from the game. You can pay 2 and tap it to make a copy of the imprinted instant and play the copy without paying its mana cost. This most notably goes infinite when you imprint Dramatic Reversal. Scroll Rack is an artifact that costs 2. You can pay 1 and tap it, then choose any number of cards in your hand and set those cards aside. Put an equal number of cards from the top of your library into your hand, then put those cards set aside on top of your library in any order. When paired up with shuffle effects, this is a great draw spell to sculpt your hand. Felwar Stone is an artifact that also costs 2. It has tap, add to your mana pool 1 mana of any color that a land an opponent controls could produce. Felwar Stone was forgotten about when Arcane Signet was printed, but this is still a very good rock that only costs 2 mana. Skull Clamp is an equipment that costs 1, with an equipment cost of 1. Equipped creature gets +1, -1, and when equipped creature is put into a graveyard, draw 2 cards. Perfect draw spell for those 1/1 token decks, but can also be used on those mana dorks when you don't need them anymore. And that's it. Those are my highlights from Zendikar Rising. Overall, I think the set is unique. It feels like they are trying to get control of the growing power creep issue, but there are some diamonds in the rough. The new cards in the commander decks were very lackluster and were definitely made for more casual play. The list has some amazing cards in it, but unfortunately, there is a low chance of you pulling one of those cards in a set booster. And now it's your turn. Let me know what card you're most excited about and what interactions I missed. If you made it this far, I want to thank you for sticking it out through the whole video, and don't forget to leave a like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for stopping by, and I'll see you next time.